They don't force you. They don't threaten you. They don't need to, because by the time you realize what's happened, the choice you thought was yours was never really a choice at all. Manipulation isn't about control. It's about perception. It's the art of making someone believe they're deciding freely while every thought, every doubt, every conclusion has been quietly placed there. The most dangerous form of influence isn't the one you can see. It's the one that feels like your own voice. You think you know when you're being manipulated. You imagine it would be obvious, aggressive, pushy, something you'd recognize and resist. But that's the misconception that makes it work. Real manipulation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with warning signs. It comes disguised as concern, as logic, as care, as the reasonable voice telling you that maybe, just maybe, you're the one who's wrong. Manipulators don't change what you see. They change how you see it. They don't rewrite reality. They rewrite your interpretation of reality. The facts remain the same, but somehow the meaning shifts. What felt right yesterday feels uncertain today. What you knew becomes what you question. And slowly, imperceptibly, your internal compass begins pointing in directions you never intended to go. The foundation of all manipulation is vulnerability, not weakness. Vulnerability. The human need to be understood, to belong, to be valued, to avoid pain. These aren't flaws, they're what make us human. But in the hands of someone who understands how to exploit them, they become access points, entry wounds through which influence seeps in. Fear is the first tool, not terror, not panic. Just enough fear to make you hesitate. Fear of being wrong. Fear of causing conflict. Fear of losing something you value. Fear of being alone. The manipulator doesn't create these fears. They already exist in you. They simply find them, isolate them, and feed them until they grow large enough to override your judgment. Then comes guilt, the quiet suggestion that you're responsible for someone else's emotional state, that your boundaries are forms of cruelty, that protecting yourself is a kind of betrayal. Guilt is perhaps the most sophisticated weapon in the manipulator's arsenal because it turns your own conscience against you. You're not being controlled by them. You're being controlled by your own desire to be good. Validation becomes currency. The manipulator positions themselves as the sole source of affirmation you need. They praise you when you comply. They withdraw when you resist. Not obviously, not dramatically. Just enough for you to notice the difference. Just enough for you to start performing for their approval without realizing you're performing at all. The need to belong transforms into a trap. Humans are tribal creatures. We're wired to maintain connection, to avoid exile, to stay within the group. The manipulator understands this instinct and weaponizes it. They make themselves the group. They become the arbiter of inclusion, and the price of belonging becomes your autonomy. Insecurity gets amplified. Whatever doubts you carry about yourself, whatever wounds remain unhealed, the manipulator finds them, not to help you heal, to keep them open, to remind you, subtly, constantly, that without their guidance, without their presence, you might not be enough. They don't destroy your confidence overtly. They erode it. One small comment, one raised eyebrow, one moment of withheld approval at a time. What makes manipulation so insidious is its patience. It doesn't demand immediate surrender. It works slowly, incrementally. Each small compromise feels reasonable in isolation. Each boundary crossed seems minor. Each time you doubt yourself, it's just a moment of uncertainty. But these moments accumulate. They compound. And one day you look up and realize you don't recognize your own thinking anymore. Your perception shifts first. What once seemed clear becomes murky. What once felt certain becomes negotiable. The manipulator introduces just enough doubt, just enough alternative interpretation, that your firm ground becomes soft. They don't tell you that you're wrong. They ask questions. They raise possibilities. They plant seeds of uncertainty and let your own mind do the rest. Your emotions become unreliable. You feel angry, but they're so calm. You feel hurt, but they're so reasonable. You feel confused, but they're so certain. and gradually you begin to trust their emotional reality more than your own. Your thinking gets colonized. The voice in your head that used to sound like you starts echoing their logic, their phrases, their interpretations. You catch yourself justifying their behavior, explaining away the discomfort, defending them against your own doubts, not because they've convinced you they're right, because they've convinced you that you might be wrong. The effect is profound. Decision-making becomes agonizing. Confidence drains slowly. Self-trust dissolves. You begin to lose your sense of what's normal, what's acceptable, what you deserve. And here's the cruelest truth. Manipulation doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like connection, like understanding, like someone who finally gets you. That's why it works. That's why intelligent, self-aware people fall into it. Because the trap is designed to look like safety. The most damaging aspect isn't what the manipulator does to you. It's what you begin doing to yourself. You monitor your thoughts. You suppress your needs. You become your own jailer. This is the architecture of psychological manipulation. Not force, but the silent reconstruction of your inner world. But something in you still knows, some instinct that hasn't been erased, because understanding the mechanism is the first step towards seeing through it. The techniques have names, clinical terms for experiences that often feel deeply personal, confusing, and impossible to explain, because manipulation is rarely chaotic. It is structured, precise, psychologically engineered. Gaslighting is one of its most destabilizing forms, not simple disagreement, not miscommunication, but the deliberate erosion of your certainty. Your memory becomes questionable. Your perception becomes unreliable. Events you clearly recall are calmly denied. Reactions you consider reasonable are reframed as irrational. And over time, a dangerous shift occurs. You stop defending your version of reality. You start investigating it. Guilt conditioning operates more quietly. It does not attack your logic. It attacks your conscience. Boundaries become cruelty. Self-respect becomes selfishness. Emotional discomfort becomes evidence of moral failure. The manipulator does not need to demand compliance. Your own sense of decency enforces it automatically. Emotional blackmail follows a subtler script. There are no explicit threats, no dramatic ultimatums, only consequences that feel deeply implied. Affection becomes conditional, warmth becomes unstable, distance becomes punishment, and slowly autonomy begins to feel expensive. Validation control reshapes motivation itself. Approval becomes psychological oxygen. Disapproval becomes emotional suffocation. Decisions are no longer driven by internal alignment, but by anticipated reactions. Fear framing disguises control as protection. Doubt becomes guidance. Restriction becomes care. Isolation becomes wisdom. And reality distortion completes the loop. Truth is not removed. It is repositioned. Context altered, meaning recalibrated, until something accurate begins serving something deceptive. The individuals who master these dynamics often present themselves in recognizable psychological archetypes. The charmer thrives on intensity, rapid connection, accelerated trust. They generate emotional gravity, making you feel uniquely seen, uniquely understood, uniquely chosen. But intensity is not always intimacy. Sometimes it is reconnaissance, a rapid study of vulnerabilities disguised as affection. The victim player leverages empathy. Nothing is ever fully their responsibility. Every conflict becomes their suffering. Every boundary becomes abandonment. You do not feel controlled. You feel obligated, trapped not by fear, but by compassion. The silent controller uses absence instead of confrontation, withdrawal instead of argument, coldness instead of criticism. You are not pressured. You are destabilized, left searching for invisible mistakes, correcting behaviors no one explicitly challenged. The authority manipulator weaponizes certainty, experience, confidence, intellectual dominance. Your perspective is never aggressively dismissed, only patiently invalidated, explained away, reduced, until self-doubt begins replacing self-trust. And then there is the emotional predator, the most psychologically invasive form. They do not merely influence situations, they influence internal states. They identify emotional wounds and integrate themselves directly into them, becoming simultaneously the trigger and the relief. the discomfort and the solution, the instability and the anchor. The warning signs rarely appear dramatic. They manifest as patterns. You notice you are always apologizing, even when unsure why. You notice conversations subtly redirecting toward your flaws whenever their behavior is questioned. You notice exhaustion that feels psychological rather than physical, confusion that feels chronic rather than situational, a persistent sense that something is wrong, without being able to articulate precisely what. Here lies the paradox. Intelligent individuals often prove more susceptible to manipulation, not due to lack of awareness, but due to excess of interpretation. They search for nuance, complexity, hidden explanations. They assume depth where intention may be simple, control. Their introspection becomes leverage. Their empathy becomes entry. Their rationality becomes camouflage for another's distortion. Psychological traps maintain the cycle. Sunk cost fallacy convinces you that leaving invalidates your investment. Cognitive dissonance pressures you to preserve belief in someone's goodwill. Hope sustains attachment to an earlier version of reality that never fully existed. Because manipulation is rarely introduced midway, it is embedded from the beginning, carefully layered beneath charm, attention, intensity, reassurance. What appears to be deterioration is often revelation. Breaking free requires a reconstruction of perception, not aggressive resistance, but stabilized clarity, trusting internal signals without demanding external consensus, recognizing patterns without needing dramatic proof. Emotional detachment becomes essential, not emotional coldness, but observational distance, the capacity to analyze dynamics without being fully consumed by them, to distinguish emotional intensity from emotional truth. Self-trust must be rebuilt incrementally. Independent decisions, unfiltered reactions, reality documented when necessary, not to convince others, but to anchor oneself against distortion. Most critically, one must abandon a comforting but inaccurate assumption that psychological frameworks are universal. Empathy is not universal. Conscience is not universal. Perceptual honesty is not universal. Some individuals do not violate these principles accidentally. They exploit them intentionally. And manipulation cannot be resolved through increased understanding, because its foundation is not misunderstanding, but asymmetry, one party seeking connection, the other seeking control. The path forward emerges not through perfect psychological analysis, but through revised tolerance, changing not how deeply you understand, but what you are willing to normalize, because your perception is your primary instrument for navigating reality. Anyone consistently destabilizing that instrument is not enhancing your clarity. They are compromising your autonomy. Manipulation survives in darkness, in hesitation, in chronic self-doubt. Clarity disrupts the system, not perfect clarity, not complete certainty, but sufficient awareness to detect distortion as it occurs, to recognize influence when it shifts into psychological restructuring. Because the most dangerous manipulators never control your behavior directly. They control your interpretation of behavior. They do not silence your voice. They replace it, gradually, quietly, systematically, until their perspective feels indistinguishable from your own thinking. But once the mechanism becomes visible, once the architecture reveals itself, once perception regains stability, the entire dynamic changes, because awareness alters power, and a mind that sees clearly becomes extraordinarily difficult to control. If you value understanding the hidden psychological forces shaping behavior, perception, and influence, then continue sharpening that awareness. Subscribe, because the strongest mind is not the one that resists manipulation, but the one that recognizes it instantly